So, good afternoon. I also get a little nervous talking publicly, so especially telling this story. So forgive the reading. I'm scripted, and it's very personal. So, my name is Teresa Pasquini. I am a California mom on a mission to save my son's life and possibly our national soul. I'm thrilled and humbled to be here in New Orleans to join this amazing day of learning with so many heroes of mine from around the country, including my dear friend Janet Hayes. Janet is one of the most dedicated advocates for people who live with a serious mental illness. Our nation and the NOLA community is so lucky to have her devotion and commitment to this fight for families like mine, yours, and ours. And after today, we will be connected in a more special way because of Janet. So. I'll do that again, I'm sure. So I need to frame my comments by sharing what drives my passion and commitment to this work. I am the proud mom of an adult son with a 37-year-old son who lives heroically with schizoaffective disorder and has spent the majority of the past 20 years in psychiatric facilities behind locked doors. He is also a former inmate, number 201-202-796. I have committed myself to shattering silence and speaking out about our family journey because I want the world to know that my son is more than an illness or a number. His name is Danny, and he is my beloved son. When I brought my firstborn son home and walked through the door of our home, I would have never thought that he would have to walk through so many doors, wrong doors in his life. Doors, hope, and harm have been a running theme in our life since our son was diagnosed with a serious mental illness at the age of 16. However, I'd like to go back to the beginning of my experience with the mental health system. My first defining memory of mental illness came when my brother jumped off the Richmond-San Rafael Bridge. He had been having command hallucinations to kill himself in order to save his family from the mafia. He drove his car over every Bay Area bridge and settled on the Richmond-San Rafael Bridge because it was the least congested. He parked his car at the highest point of the top deck and climbed onto the railing. He carefully lowered himself to a hanging position and released his grip. His body hit the water perfectly, which saved his life. He described seeing the colors of the water change as he crashed into the bay and knew immediately that he wanted to live. A local fisherman fortunately rescued him by pulling his body with a broken back into a small boat. He was taken to the closest emergency room and transferred to an intensive care unit, and once medically stable, he went to a local psychiatric hospital. Visiting my brother at this hospital was my first experience on a locked psychiatric unit. I have to admit that prior to this family crisis, I had not been the greatest sister. I did not understand the severity of his brain illness or the extent of his suffering. I just knew that our family was in chaos. However, the experience of going behind that locked door, seeing my handsome brother laying in a bed with a broken back and a broken brain, changed me forever, and I would never view serious mental illness in the same way again. Because my brother had been a high school sports star and the student body president, his suicide attempt was reported in the local papers. But still, my dad urged us not to talk about what had happened. I'm like, Dad, it was in the paper. You know, not a secret. But don't tell. But this was almost 45 years ago when stigma and shame were even more prominent. However, treatment was much more accessible. And so my brother recovered after many months of inpatient care. And with strong family support, outpatient services, including medication and therapy, he was able to return to college and receive his master's in special education. He went on to teach for many years in the inner city of Richmond, California, where he taught kids to love learning and life. He had a couple of relapses and eventually retired after teaching, but he has lived independently for years. He is one of my heroes and a true recovery success story. At birth, my son Danny was the most beautiful and healthy baby. I know all moms say that, but he was. Who would have ever believed that this perfect and pure little boy would grow up and spend so much of his adult life shunned by society and locked away from his family because of a brain illness? His first psychiatric hospitalization occurred at the age of 16, and because of the collaborative efforts of an amazing pediatrician and therapist, Danny was also diagnosed at 16. Because he had the same illness as my brother, I knew what was happening and was not as shell-shocked as most families. So early treatment began and education supports were secured. A job and high school diploma were achieved. Danny was in a peer support group, and my husband and I were in parenting support group to learn everything we could to help our son. We thought we had managed his care. Treatment worked until the age of 18, and then the system allowed it to stop working. On his 18th birthday, Danny was involuntarily hospitalized for the second time. Because of HIPAA, I literally learned overnight that I had no rights as a mom, even though even to know where he was being held. And because my county did not have assisted outpatient treatment, the only way to ensure his safety and treatment was to support a public LPS conservatorship. Over the next 18 years, I have fought to annually renew his conservatorship, even taking the stand twice. At 19, Danny's multiple revolving hospitalizations began. He would spend months behind locked doors in faraway facilities. My husband and I would visit him every weekend, no matter how far away. When he returned to live in our home or a community placement, the medically necessary continuity of care and support quickly failed. It was during one of the early hospitalizations that a psychiatrist said to us, "You know, you'd be really lucky to get him into the criminal justice system." He said it as if it was like getting your child into Stanford or UCLA. I didn't understand back then, but what that psychiatrist meant was that there's no long-term mental health care as part of our system anymore. He meant your son's sick, your son needs long-term care, and jail is where we are providing long-term mental health care these days. I became an SMI warrior mom that day. I began learning about all the systems that were designed to keep me from helping my son. Although my son always wanted his family involved and included as part of the treatment team, clinicians often ignored or dismissed our input, and sometimes even blamed him or us for his symptoms. I see you smiling, Ralph. So even though I had experienced the mental health system with my brother many years before, absolutely nothing would prepare my husband or I for what was to come into our lives. The past 20 years have been a blur of suicide attempts, over 50 involuntary holds, revolving hospitalizations, incarcerations, and a permanent LPS conservatorship. We had resources, insurance, and my full-time ability to navigate a maze of services in one of the most integrated healthcare systems, but it was still a nightmare. When Danny was 28, after years of navigating the public and private systems, we were urged to drop private insurance in order to get him access into a private facility that into a treatment facility that only took Medi-Cal. That worked at first, and then it failed because there was never adequate staffing, continuity of care, and no access to timely, appropriate, quality treatment. It is cruel to force someone into treatment, take them away from their family, get them into the best shape ever, and then let them fall off the cliff again. This happened multiple times. I reflected on our family experience during a visit to see Danny. While my husband and I drove a total of 5 hours round trip. Psychiatric patients are often not treated near their home, but in out-of-county placements. When we arrived, our son, who was 29 at the time, came running with such happiness at the side of our car and stopped at a high-wire fence, waving to us. It reminded me of when he was in the schoolyard it reminded me when he was in kindergarten, when he used to run to the schoolyard fence to greet me. The fence reminded my husband of a prison, and it took him a while to get out of the car and head into that visit. My husband still struggles with his inability to rescue our son from his symptoms and the system. They have stolen his son's freedom, dignity, and often the will to live. We worked hard to hold on to hope when our son continuously suffered from a broken system that tried to break us all. So in 2012, after multiple involuntary hospitalizations and a lack of community supports that prevented him from becoming a danger to himself and others again and again, Danny was sent to Napa State Hospital on a civil, not a criminal, forensic commitment. Our experience at Napa State Hospital was okay at first, but then it turned terribly wrong. Napa State Hospital's unwillingness to communicate with Contra Costa's treatment team about the medications that had previously been effective led to horrific outcomes for Danny and others. And they refused to listen to me, his mom, who knew him best. After 5 consecutive days of seclusion and restraints, Danny lashed out and was charged with felony assault. This picture is at Napa State Hospital on his 30th birthday, 5 days before his arrest. It would be the last time I would hug him for months. So even though Danny had never been arrested as an adult, he was arrested as a patient and criminalized for serious mental illness. We had tried to do everything we could to prevent harm to self or others and keep Danny out of the criminal justice system. But now he would spend 23 hours a day in a jail cell in the beautiful Napa Valley. I again went into warrior mom mode. This became my greatest fight to date, keeping my son out of state prison. I will never forget the first time Danny was brought out to visit at the Napa County Jail. His hands were chained and he could barely hold the phone. But he reassured me that he was okay as the tears flowed down my cheeks and we touched goodbye through glass as he was taken back to his cell. So, Danny and our family began revolving through the criminal justice and state hospital's revolving door. We would spend the next 4 years in and out of solitary jail cells, courtrooms, and state hospitals on an incompetent to stand trial hold. It is a torturous process. I could feel my Danny slowly dying from hopelessness and fear. I felt a daily ache in my soul because of his absence, his vulnerability, and his pending charges. As is common, he had picked up additional charges in jail. I feared that he would never behave his way back home. I feared that we might never see him walk back through that door I carried him through as a baby. The same door that he walked out of in handcuffs over 50 times during a psychiatric crisis, when I was forced to call 911 for help. I tried to do my job to keep him safe and others safe. It felt like the health system had failed us both. I attended every court hearing in order to communicate with his attorney and ensure that Danny felt unconditional love. I positioned myself in the courtroom so that he could see me and I could see him. When Danny entered the court behind clear partition, I could tell in his body language that he was nervous, and as he approached to speak to his attorney. I watched his stress level decline as his shoulders relaxed, while his attorney explained to him that he would be declared incompetent to stand trial and sent to a state hospital again. At one point, a great big smile flashed across his face, and he glanced over at me. We are ordered not to communicate in court, but I always made sure to smile back. However, I would drive back to Contra Costa County feeling angry and hopeless because I knew that there was a human logjam of inmates just like Danny waiting for a state hospital bed. I knew that he would wait for weeks in limbo and in solitary, and there was nothing that felt civil or right or just about our circumstance. So with 2 failed attempts to restore competency at Napa, Danny was sent to Atascadero State Hospital in 2014. After months of court and jail barriers, we drove over 5 hours to touch our son skin to skin for the first time in almost a year. We are fortunate to have the resources for these trips and know that not all families are so lucky. We were much happier with his care at ASH and were able to establish a true therapeutic partnership with his treatment team. Danny's meds were adjusted, and he began to modify and control his behavior. But the threat of returning to competency, solitary, and possibly sentenced to prison was ever present. When my son was first diagnosed, I learned that the only control I had was over my voice and our story. So I joined every local, state, national forum to shatter shame, the status quo, and influence system change for families like mine. I served as a Contra Costa County Mental Health Commissioner for 9 years, and in 2009, I joined with the leaders of our public hospital and became a founding member of one of the first hospital-based partnerships focused on psychiatric patients and families. I was determined to make our community system welcoming and accessible for all and prevent the suffering our family was living. As my son was free-falling through the tattered safety net, I began working with my community psychiatric and detention partners. It was this partnership work that took down my anger wall and taught me to never apologize for speaking up on behalf of the most vulnerable, like my son. I now refer to myself as a recovering angry mom. My work with our public system taught me that nobody comes to work to harm, and that we must work together to guarantee that all patients receive one care everywhere. In 2010, I joined with several consumers and families from across the state to question how California was funding specialty mental health services for people who have been given their Medicaid card as disabled adults, which has entitled them to medical care for everything except their serious mental illness. I knew that there were hundreds of psychiatrically disabled people in my community and across the state who were not getting access to safe, efficient, timely, equitable care. So we began protesting, testifying, and partnering with anyone willing to get real about the suffering, waste, and harm. We began demanding a right to treatment before tragedy. Then, following the Newtown tragedy in 2012, families from across the country united to tell our stories on Capitol Hill. Met Deb Giesling, who's going to be on our panel at that time on Facebook, and it's a privilege to meet her face-to-face today. We've been fighting together for 7 years. So we joined the efforts of the Treatment Advocacy Center, DJ Jaffe, and others to support then Congressman Tim Murphy's The Helping Families in Mental Health Crisis Act, which focused on the 10 million suffering with serious mental illnesses. Many of those families believe that serious mental illness is the greatest health disparity of our time. We believe that understanding the implicit bias, cultural disparities, and system prejudice against people with serious psychiatric disorders are critical to transforming the discriminatory systems that have led to the trans-institutionalization of our loved ones. We believed that it was time to shatter the silence. So in May of 2015, I was invited to a media event on Capitol Hill with a panel of families. 3 of the 6 families on that panel were from California. That is not something to be proud of. We told our horror stories of failed first care in California. Many couldn't understand how this was happening in California since we had all that funding from Prop 63, the millionaire's tax, and the Medicaid expansion through the ACA. But few people understand the legal and fiscal discrimination against people with serious mental illnesses in California. They don't know that federal and state parity does not apply to those on Medicaid and Medicare, and that public specialty mental health services in our state are funded only to the extent resources are available. Few people understand that when our governor took almost $1 billion from the 1991 realignment fund in 2017-18 state budget, he prevented counties from providing adequate medically necessary treatment in a mental health rehabilitation facility for people living with SMI. Few people understand that the IMD exclusion prevents federal funding for long-term psychiatric hospital beds, or the direct correlation between the closing of hospital beds and increase in mental health jail cells. But I understand because I've lived it. And so it is with this understanding that I encourage all local, state, and national partners, as Janet said before, to understand that in order to prevent and intervene with incarceration of the most seriously mentally ill population, we must not only complete the community mental health system, but also rebuild the hospital-based system. This should be a both and, not an either-or priority. In essence, we must understand the need to marry the medical model with the recovery model, not divorce the two. Because of luck and heroics, Danny was transferred to a diversion unit of an IMD in Merced County on a civil commitment. in November of 2016. In an innovative agreement between Contra Costa County and the Napa County Superior Court, he continued to receive competency training, but in a more therapeutic setting. I strongly encourage the consideration of this type of incompetent to stand trial placement in an innovative diversionary model that must be replicated. It saved jail time, a state hospital bed, allowed justice to be served. The outcomes were priceless for my son, who finally had all criminal charges dropped in August of 2017 and restored to an LPS civil commitment. This would not have happened without the partnership of the courts, public defenders, district attorneys, sheriff deputies, public conservators, administrators, mental health providers, all working together in partnership with our family. Danny survived solitary because of luck and heroics and relationships. It had nothing to do with access to a continuous system of psychiatric care, because that doesn't exist. Danny lived at California Psychiatric Transitions in a locked IMD for almost 3 years. This placement was fully funded by Contra Costa County using limited realignment funds. Due to the IMD exclusion, Medi-Cal reimbursement was not accessible for this placement. The outcomes from this placement were miraculous for Danny because he received the right care at the right time and in the right place. He was stabilized on clozapine and lithium. He worked through all levels of the program. He learned about his illness and symptom management, and was able to gain insight for the first time since being diagnosed 20 years earlier. He made friends with both staff and his peers. He had no violent outbursts towards himself or others, and he eventually worked his way home for a pass. So for the first time in 6 years, Danny was able to come home for Christmas and sleep in his own bed, meet his new brother-in-law, and visit his only surviving grandmother. 3 of his beloved grandparents had died while he was locked away. He never had a chance to kiss them goodbye. These are the moments we steal from our sons, from families like mine, when we refuse to build and fund a full continuum of psychiatric care. As I watched our son's recovery progress, I knew that he would be considered for community placement in the least restrictive setting. He was nearing graduation from CPT, something he had never previously achieved in other placements. But I knew that there had not been any new housing programs developed in my home county, and I feared that this hard-fought progress would be lost if he returned to programs where he had previously been unsuccessful. So I began researching alternatives. I learned that many of the patients who were living at CPT were stepping down to a program called Synergy in Morgan Hill. I reached out to other families whose children had lived at Synergy and reached out to Linda Kaufman, who manages all the Synergy County insurance contracts, as well as the client development admissions team. After speaking with Linda, I knew immediately that I wanted Danny to go to Synergy next. I learned from my discussion with Linda that the Synergy vision is modeled after the Trieste, Italy program, a mental health program that the World Health Organization considers as evidence-based. Synergy also uses the modified therapeutic community model and the tenets of MTC to be inclusive of peer supports. The MTC model helps people successfully move from locked care with client development and co-located wraparound clinical supports available 7 days a week. But the thing that hit me in the heart the most is when I learned that Synergy will take the patients that others have blacklisted and that they've only had 2 patients that they would not take again in all the years that they've been operating. That was huge, since my Danny had been blacklisted by too many programs in his life, and he had come too far to fail again. So I wrote one of my infamous emails to our county leadership, asking them to consider a single case agreement with Synergy and allow Danny to test their program. I made the case that this would be both a clinical and fiscally prudent consideration, not only for Danny, but for other clients in our specialty mental health system. My county partners agreed, and steps were taken to secure an agreement and contract with Synergy. After 2.5 years at CPT, Danny graduated and moved from a locked program to a community setting for the first time in many, many years. Because Synergy had been outreaching to him during the client development period, Danny was able to become familiar with their program. This was a warmer handoff than being awoken by jail guards and told it's time to travel across state to an unknown place surrounded by barbed wire. He made the smooth transition to Synergy in February of this year and is the Contra Costa County trailblazer for this excellent program. This is the first successful community placement for our son ever. Now Danny and other Contra Costa clients will have the opportunity to heal in an unlocked residential setting and further his stability in freedom. I have kept a running diary on Facebook since my son's jail release called Danny Days. I have been publicly posting his story from solitary to sanity in order to shatter the silence and the shame. Because of treatment, he now speaks in his own voice on video, and it shows that he is not evil or a monster. He is sweet, kind, funny, human. He was savable, not a throwaway. I am so very proud of him. Thank you. So in early 2019, I began traveling across the state with another mom on a mission, Lauren Retaliata. Lauren and I had become advocacy allies when we served together on our state-mandated local mental health commission. Beyond our local service, we were friends and kindred moms who have become hyper-focused on learning all we can and how to ensure that our county and state will have a continuum of psychiatric care that includes what we have coined housing that heals. Like other families, we have sat in local and state meetings for years and watched endless system mapping events and minutes taken while our life clocks tick and our sons fall off cliff after cliff, and our families fall off too. We have endlessly watched housing plans envisioned, planned, and prioritized, but never implemented, as our sons have been either homeless, incarcerated, or placed in multiple levels of poor quality hospital-based and community housing. Like other aging parents, we carry the fear of what will happen when we are gone and wonder if our sons will be left with no place like home. So Lauren and I set out on a journey to go see what we could find, if we could find the best models of housing that heals in California. We set out in search of knowledge that might help answer some of the questions that we have heard endlessly debated while the fiscal and human waste grows. We set out looking for solutions that will cure a health system that is often too rigid, harmful, inhumane, and broken. We left our own homes and families seeking knowledge that would unlock the human logjam that currently clogs California's streets, prisons, courts, jails, acute hospital, wards, ERs, and many family homes. We set out with a focused vision of hope that we would find existing housing that heals for the most severely mentally ill populations who rely on California's health care and safety net. We did find hope. We found people who care deeply and who have been building what we dream of for our families. We found that when California counties invest in building a psychiatric continuum of care, people who live heroically with SMI will come, they will stay, and they will live in optimal health, stability, safety, and peace. What we discovered is that there are places of healing, places of humanity sprinkled across our state. However, we also found that housing for those who have a serious mental illness is impacted at every level. This is the status quo that I refuse to accept. So I will spend the rest of my life advocating for a full continuum of psychiatric care that includes all levels of housing that heals. That continuum must include fully funded IMDs, adult residential facilities for those who cannot survive in supported independent living and don't deserve to be housed in a jail pod or a cardboard tent. I am a mom on a mission to ensure that there will be a place for my son to live when I am in health, safety, and dignity, when I am no longer here, and I want that for all people with serious brain disorders. So, my purpose for taking this journey is to start a crucial conversation that will not leave my son uncounted. This is a moment in time when our collective community purpose must be constant, fluid, flexible, and adaptable when people are their most vulnerable. And vulnerability must always be viewed as an opportunity to empower health and healing through our shared humanity. In order to do that, We have to stop blurring the lines of our health system and just remove the lines. No more us and them, no more carve-outs, no more cherry picking based on luck and heroics, zip code, or diagnosis. No more drivers of disparity and discrimination for sons like mine. He needs us all to work together in authentic partnership where we can design a system that includes a continuum of psychiatric care from crisis acute, subacute, and a tiered array of supported housing that allows everyone to live and die with dignity. This is housing that heals. I have seen it, and I know it's possible. I believe in the power of public health and safety partnerships that include providers, law enforcement, detention staff, psychiatrists, judges, public defenders, DAs, peers, families, and our neighbors. We are allies, not enemies, and we must help each other design a system of health and care, not luck and heroics. So, in closing, I urge a different policy mindset on the local, state, and federal level for the SMI population. The current outcomes of untreated SMI are cruel and unusual and inhumane, and people are dying. It should not be so hard to help desperate people. We can do better, we must do better, we will do better. This work of the heart and brokenhearted is work of the heart and brokenhearted, and we are all trying so hard to fix this system. We aren't there yet, but days like today will bring us closer to change, and change must happen. So I thank you for being here today, learning together, because really we are all on the front line together, and together is the only way forward. Thank you.